Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Pamela Zevitt, and I'm the Special Projects Coordinator for the South Coast Conservation Program. And glad that you could make it out this morning. I'd really like to thank our hosts at the Canadian Society for Environmental Biologists. And they have enabled us to actually have this webinar this morning by hosting us through their online system. I'd also like to thank Environment and Climate Change Canada for the funding that they've provided through the Habitat Stewardship Program for Species at Risk, which has enabled us to focus our efforts in regards to working with local governments, but also to reach out to you through things like webinar series and workshops. This is, as I mentioned, the fourth in a series of webinars focusing on species at risk, critical habitat, and the types of tools and resources that many of our partners, such as local governments, the province, and the feds, are working on to try to move forward with more progressive policy, bylaws, and other types of regulatory mechanisms. Now, as an organization, the South Coast Conservation Program works with a lot of local governments. We also work with private landowners through our Nature Stewards program. And we have been focused on more of the policy and conservation science aspect of stewardship for species at risk and critical habitat protection since around 2005. So we are looking forward to actually continuing this webinar series. We'll have another one in the spring. And if you want to take a look at the webinars that we've produced to date, you can go to our YouTube channel. The URL is down at the bottom of this slide, and I'll be giving you that link again at the end of the webinar. Our presenters today are Alison Peet, who's a registered professional biologist and environmental planner, and she works with South Okanagan Similkameen Conservation Program. She's going to be talking about the Shared Environmental Planner project that she's been involved with for the last few years. Our second speaker is Erica Nasachuk, who's also a professional biologist, and she's an environmental protection officer with the District of North Vancouver. She's going to be focused a little bit more on specific bylaw tools, looking at the district's development permit areas, and focused on how they are applying those sort of regulatory mechanisms through the local government process to expand more broader protection for species at risk and critical habitat. And now I'd like to turn it over to Alison, and then we're going to move directly into Erica's presentation, and we'll wrap things up with comments at the end.
Communicate and to collaborate. Occasionally, at the request of our partners, SOSCP also initiates projects to identify or to address identified gaps in the protection of biodiversity, and this shared planner project is an example of this. Various SOSCP partners noted that local governments had limited access to services that support their understanding of the environmental implications of development. Might be a surprise to those of you who work in the Lower Mainland that there hadn't been any environmental planners working for local governments in the Okanagan. So the Shared Planner project was built by SOSCP partners seeking to reintroduce environmental planning services for local governments in the Okanagan Similkameen. Historically, only the regional district had an in-house environmental planner, but after the position was made redundant almost a decade ago, none of the local governments in our region had an environmental planner. With the birth of the professional reliance model, local governments understood that the user would pay for these services, and most of our local governments are smaller with limited resources to fund environmental planning. Occasionally for big projects, local governments in our region hired consultants, but day-to-day review of riparian regulations and environmental impact assessment was achieved with the scrutiny of an environmental professional providing advice without the scrutiny of an environmental professional providing advice specifically for that local government. SOSCP's biodiversity strategy and many of its environmental planning objectives would have been difficult or impossible to achieve without environmental planning support for local governments. Thus, SOSCP partners wanted someone who would be familiar with environmental concerns and priorities who could carry their concerns directly to local governments. So local governments had questions about using professional advice on environmental issues. Having managed for years without this service, they have asked me questions. they've asked me things like, isn't the developer's qualified environmental professional or QEP providing the advice we need? Will this service help us do our job, or will it make our work more difficult? Will working with you result in unwanted pressures to protect environmental values in ways that we are not able to? As many of you will know from the South Coast Conservation Program, a conservation partnership is not a non-government organization created to lobby for a conservation agenda. Thus, our partners are diverse, and while we work together on conservation and biodiversity-related issues, it is the implementation of our biodiversity strategy that brings us together, rather than some agenda to push local governments to make green decisions. This is an important distinction for those looking at a shared environmental planner model and wanting to understand if this partnership somehow prevents local governments from acting with autonomy. After almost 8 years of this program, my local governments don't think the shared planner is practically perfect with Mary Poppins. You'll have to forgive me for the slide that suggests that I am practically perfect. I just couldn't resist. But I think it's fair to say their concerns are about the project, their concerns about this project have been diminished by the experiences that we've had over the past 8 years. Support for the program continues with both SOSCP and local governments finding ways to improve efficiency and effectiveness of collaboration, using approaches tailored to each specific community. The work of the shared planner can be broad or targeted depending on what each local government needs. Examples of project tasks include helping to interpret and enhance qualified professional direction in assessments, implementing habitat protection projects on the ground, protecting species at risk, conducting outreach, training staff, advising on legislation, assisting with parks management and planning, participating in council sessions, answering questions at public meetings, as well as providing advice to update official community plans, bylaws, and other regulatory tools. So jokes about professional reliance go with the territory where I work. Under professional reliance, qualified professionals provide advice to inform development, but this advice does not necessarily address local government needs. I see my share of frustration over the work of QEPs and what some local governments perceive as a lack of accountability. When local governments have questions, having an environmental planner working for them helps provide independent advice. The shared planner project still works within the reliance on professionals model, but the shared planner helps provide advice to support a community's understanding of what the QEP is saying, enabling government staff to ask informed questions and facilitate assessment reports that provide the best possible advice to local government. I function like a translator between governments and partners, governments and QEPs, and sometimes even between different levels of government. A significant component of the project also focuses on trying to make interactions more efficient to reduce the amount of back and forth required to achieve high-quality development planning, permitting, and monitoring. With limited access to environmental advice from other sources like provincial and federal governments, the Shared Planner project helps provide consistent support to local governments. When there are complex issues, part of my job is to help local governments find experts and resources to understand the problems and solutions. Similarly, with increasing responsibilities to address species at risk and critical habitat, I help support local governments in making informed decisions related to legislative responsibilities under provincial and federal laws. For example, we noticed that there's been a lot of confusion by planners about the term capital C, capital H, critical habitat, and what that meant, because small c, small h, critical habitat was a term already in use within most of our official community plans. Generally, I think most planners thought this was a technical term understood by QEPs. Meanwhile, QEPs were confused about what the term meant as well, and particularly young QEPs had not learned how to obtain this new information. Almost everyone had difficulty translating capital C, capital H, critical habitat protection into avoidance and mitigation strategies in environmental assessments. As many of you may know, much of the protection for species at risk at critical habitat on private land is being enabled through voluntary stewardship, but local governments have opportunities to ensure that critical habitat is identified and considered in decisions about development. SOSCP believes that our shared planner project has helped shine a light on critical habitat in ways that would have been difficult to achieve otherwise. We haven't solved all the issues, but because our project keeps providing comments to QEPs and local governments, reminding them about where to get information and how to use that information to inform development planning, understanding is growing, and some important areas of critical habitat have been identified and also protected. I wanted to take a minute to highlight the efficiency of the project and how it can work over a large area. The Shared Planner project covers an area of 1 million hectares, including 8 electoral areas and 6 municipalities. With more species at risk than any regional district in BC, except the Capital Regional District, environmental planning is clearly important in the Okanagan to support consistent environmental standards in a place where standards can help protect biodiversity not found elsewhere. Because species in sensitive habitats are not evenly distributed like a layer of peanut butter over the landscape, the practical area of focus tends to be areas with a concentration of species at risk and their habitats. If you know the Okanagan-Similkameen region, we focus on the lower elevation areas, and particularly those where development is occurring. In our area, as on the coast, the rare critters want to be in similar places to where the people want to be. Where we work is also a reflection of what our partners need or ask us to help with. Thus, we work particularly in the South Okanagan portion of our region, and most frequently with Summerland, Penticton, and the Okanagan rural areas within the Regional District of Okanagan-Similkameen. And if you look at your map, those would be areas A, C, D, E, and F. Having a local government planner helps promote communication between communities and collaboration towards solving environmental challenges. Good ideas in one community spread more easily to others because the environmental planner moves between local governments and facilitates communication about issues and solutions. For example, work with the District of Summerland and Regional District of Okanagan-Similkameen on an official community plan has promoted increasing interests in several other Okanagan-Similkameen communities. SOSCP has become the local expert on environmental planning options. What we learned from one plan update can be applied to the next. Thus, Osoyoos and Penticton have asked us to explain approaches in other communities, and they are exploring opportunities for consistency with their neighbors and beyond. Specifically, in this recent Regional District of Okanagan-Similkameen official community plan update, we developed something called a rapid environmental assessment procedure to replace exemptions from development permit requirements for single-family home development. Several other local governments are looking at using this approach themselves. This seems to help some of the regional concerns about species at risk at critical habitat, which sometimes overlaps areas of residential development. Our project doesn't create a homogeneous planning environment. Variations between communities in regulations and their application continue to exist. Conversations within local government are confidential unless communities give permission for environmental planner to share them. Each community has different environmental priorities, values, and risks, so there is room for innovation in planning approaches. I've learned from my years as a biologist that as much as we talk about wanting consistent standards across the landscape, in practice we all need opportunities for innovation and flexibility. The Shared Planner project doesn't prevent innovation or variety, but it can sometimes help one community learn from the experiences of another. Although SOSCP anticipated confidentiality might be an issue and had plans in place to address that, we find generally that limited resources, not confidentiality concerns, tend to prevent local governments from talking to one another about environmental planning. SOSCP's Shared Planner project seems to provide a desirable bridge between communities. The Shared Planner supports communities in completing environmentally sensitive development permit mapping, consistently based on conservation rank mapping from the Okanagan Biodiversity Strategy. These maps are an enhanced product based on sensitive ecosystems, but incorporating other updates and crosswalking several different mapping products to create one seamless layer for the region. Environmental development permit maps from different communities are not identical, but the common source of map products makes them look similar. Various local governments have used different approaches, several of which are shown on this slide, and this is refined and created development permit layers with the help of the shared environmental planner to articulate options and products in use by various local governments within and beyond our region. This is a webinar about species at risk, and as you can see from my presentation so far, species at risk critical habitat is a significant focus for the Shared Planner project. We received funding from Environment and Climate Change Canada Habitat Stewardship Program for Species at Risk to increase awareness of critical habitat and develop effective approaches to protect it. I spoke earlier about the education and training we include in the project, but what we do goes beyond this. In our region, our stewardship partner, Okanagan Similkameen Stewardship Society, works directly with private landowners, but the Shared Planner project occasionally has opportunities for direct stewardship with local governments. This image shows a private lot in Trout Creek Summerland that was recently subdivided. The green treed area within the red outline has been reserved from development to protect a known woodpecker nest and protect habitat attributes in an area known historically for both nesting and wintering Lewis's woodpecker. As a result of development planning, this area is now a park zoned in the district's nature preserve category. As such, while the area is set aside as green space, its primary focus is conservation. Locals enjoy this place from the edges since the decadent cottonwood creates safety hazards. Development of urban forest strategies is an emerging priority for South Okanagan communities like the city of Penticton. Completing or supporting climate change adaptation, urban forest strategies can help protect native trees, manage natural disturbances, and moderate water and air temperatures. The Shared Planner is leading an in-house effort to develop a draft strategy to share with public as part of their official community plan update. Our conversations to date have focused on questions like, what should our canopy closure targets look like? How should we manage natural areas different from other public lands? How do we address and regulate tree removal both on private and public lands? And in managing for trees, how do we negotiate trade-offs between factors like water use, fire vulnerability, and climate moderating tree canopy? Because I'm involved with this strategy, I've been able to insert a priority for looking at cottonwood protection as well, figuring out where we can manage for cottonwoods in an urban setting. Recreation use is a growing concern in our region as well. The effort to enjoy nature and cycle to wineries is not without its risks. The Okanagan is a year-round tourist destination with growing numbers of visitors to our area each year. While the tourism advocates sing the praises of the Okanagan, there is a real risk that all those people will love our nature to death. Those of you who have experience in recreation management will know that dating back to BC's first State of the Environment report, published I think in the 1990s, BC has promoted recreation as a no-impact activity, something that remains a legacy, at least in our region today. I have my work cut out for me, but Parks and Trail master plans are key tools for managing recreation in the region. The Shared Planner project provides resources to local governments to add environmental content to these master plans. This work helps governments manage recreation use implications for this area of high biodiversity. The public and business pressure to expand recreation opportunities is creating new education and assessment needs to help planners address risks to sensitive species and habitats while providing the diverse opportunities like climbing bluffs, swimming beaches, trail-based activities, and other sports enjoyed by visitors and residents. Lake health and water quality are among the highest stated priorities for Okanagan Similkameen residents and visitors. Development pressures impact our lakes and streamside areas, resulting in rapid rates of loss of natural native vegetation. This loss negatively affects species at risk promotes erosion, and increases water treatment costs. Working with other partners like the Regional District, Okanagan-Similkameen Conservation Alliance, Okanagan Wetlands Strategy, and others, the shared planner is contributing to strategic planning that seeks to influence outcomes like riparian protection and restoration, retention and restoration of wetlands, as well as sustaining and improving water quality. Both Okanagan conservation programs, that is, South Okanagan-Similkameen Conservation Program and Okanagan Collaborative Conservation Program, which operates in the North and Central Okanagan, and their partners are focused on monitoring lake health and education. Focused outreach efforts provide information to landowners and realtors about regulations and the importance of maintaining and restoring shoreline function. More creative thinking in this area is needed. We face challenges because many waterfront landowners are not residents, and thus talking to them directly is difficult. Some are not receptive to ecological arguments, and we've been thinking hard about how to explain the need for changing practices on waterfront using language that makes sense to our landowners. Also, the history of not environmentally friendly land use practices on shorelines in the Okanagan has created a culture of expectation by everyone who lives there that valuable waterfront will be lawns to the beach with a retaining wall and a dock and no riparian buffer. Many believe our shorelines were historically lacking in riparian buffers, despite legislation like Riparian Areas Regulation and Water Sustainability Act. Problems with progressive shoreline loss continue, and efforts to streamline approvals have created gaps in shoreline protection. The Shared Planner project is helping to maintain a focus on this issue, spurred on by the knowledge that various species at risk depend on protection of shorelines and lakes. So you may know that we have Rocky Mountain Ridge mussel, for example, and that's one of the species that can be affected by loss of that riparian buffer. Some of you may also be familiar with landscape connectivity cooperatives in the United States. Here in the Okanagan, we've been working to strengthen connectivity in a region called Cascadia, working through an initiative called Wild Links. Together with partners in the United States and Canada, we support local governments, First Nations, and others in connectivity projects aimed at maintaining and reestablishing effective wildlife corridor connections threatened by development, land use, and climate change. We are using science and meeting yearly to support actions to protect connections within and between our two countries. Some work is already complete. Our sister organization, Okanagan Collaborative Conservation Program, has worked with the Central Okanagan Regional District on a connectivity project on the ground. Also, I'm aware that Whatcom County is doing connectivity planning, which may be relevant to actions in the areas within and near Chilliwack. Also, for those of you thinking about planning connectivity, there is a 2014 guidance document called Designing and Implementing Ecosystem Connectivity in the Okanagan that I co-wrote with Susan Latimer. It's available on EcoCat and from the Okanagan Collaborative Conservation Program. Basically describes a method of engaging in connectivity planning for local governments, and while it is tailored to the Okanagan, it can have application at a broader landscape. I've already used the word education in this webinar talk, but I wanted to return to this again. Many of the local government partners we work with have education fatigue. Having worked for local government myself, I understand the work involved in talking to people. Many of us believe in the concept of democracy and listening to what the people have to say, but talking creates expectations for action, and the resources often are too limited to deliver on the expectations created. Lack of resources is a barrier and leads to busy government staff choosing to focus on the things they must deliver, sometimes at the expense of public understanding. I finished my years of school just about the time that governments were withdrawing from outreach projects to save tax dollars, and I have found myself making a conscious effort to share what I know because increasingly my perception is that we, the people, are asking for things of our government without understanding the consequences. Because I am arm's length from government, I can deliver information and discuss ideas with different groups without creating the same expectation of local government action. My effort is aimed at improving literacy about potential impacts of land use on key regional values like critical habitat for species at risk, shoreline habitats, wildlife trees, and wildlife corridors. Every year, the Shared Planner Project provides education and participates in workshops and conferences, but we also lead our own education events. We've sponsored an environmental roundtable with our local government members. We've held riparian areas regulation discussions. We've facilitated presentations to the public about shoreline and water issues. Because we're primarily a service of local government, our education tends to be focused on aspects of regulations and policy or practice that are relevant to local government and development. For example, we are currently developing a presentation for public works departments to explain the Migratory Birds Convention Act and other legislation of relevance to departments maintaining and removing and planting vegetation. Learning from others is also a key part of the Shared Environmental Planner's role. Representatives from many sectors share their concerns with local government. I listen, and when there are opportunities, I highlight conservation considerations, but I also learn to coordinate SOSCP priorities with broader social and economic interests. My role focuses on the environment side of the equation, but I genuinely believe that these three things are inextricably tied. I advocate for a model that recognizes that short-term economic benefits at the expense of the environment will result in long-term financial costs. These arguments are particularly easy to make when we talk about ecosystem services. Because I work with a range of SOSCP partners, I can provide them with a unique view of the opportunities and challenges facing developers, city councils, park departments, and other groups working with local governments. Thus, returning to the concern that our project could be a disguised attempt to lobby local governments, what we find instead is that the local governments influence SOSCP and its conservation partners, helping us to better understand the opportunities and challenges of the local government planners' world. Since the program began in 2010, both SOSCP and our local government partners have learned the value of high-quality information to support decision-making. While conservation impacts are not a priority in every decision, conservation information changes the way that decisions are made, increasing public and government awareness of environmental implications. When I started this work, I was warned about the risk of burnout in environmental planning. I think the understanding that I'm the information person rather than the decision maker helps more than anything else to keep me from burnout and helps this project function. I'm not the environmentalist or even necessarily the advocate for the environment. Instead, I provide a conservative professional voice in the discussions about development, identifying solutions to facilitate more environmentally friendly development with reduced risks to the environment. Before I finish, I want to present a slide that acknowledges the scope of competing interests that local governments face. With a unique view from inside local government offices, the Shared Planner Project is also providing SOSCP partners with insight about why conservation priorities may sometimes be missed. Seeking ways to move our conservation programs beyond the perception that conservation programs are anti-development, I find myself constantly trying to redefine what effective environmental planning looks like. I've spent some of my time asking for changes that are not possible and getting frustrated when my comments or suggestions were not adopted. Bryn White will tell you that one of our greatest challenges is finding a way to be professional, persuasive, and also brief when we provide comments on development proposals. For those who might see this as a model that could work elsewhere, I'd like to end with a word about funding. One of the attractions of our project is the financial benefit of participating in the program. Our local governments contribute to the program, but SOSCP also fundraises to match their contributions. This results in a service that provides double the time and resources that would otherwise be available. Our fundraising also helps provide funds for projects on the ground, demonstrating tangible conservation results on the ground and inspiring us all to continue with the difficult challenges. In conclusion, SOSCP thanks our local governments, Habitat Conservation Trust Foundation, Real Estate Foundation, and Habitat Stewardship Program for Species at Risk who helped make this project possible. And also thanks to the District of Summerland for providing me an office today to and a secure connection for the webinar.
All right, thank you so much, Allison. I really appreciate that. And definitely from the South Coast Conservation Program's standpoint, I can echo the whole issue of how important having funders and sponsors is in regards to our work. Most of our local government work was actually funded in the past 4 years through the Real Estate Foundation, and that's what got us started in regards to being able to host these webinars, but also being able to work more concertedly with local governments. And it's definitely been an interesting journey for myself and some of the folks who have been working with me on these projects over the last few years. And I think that the conversation that Erica is going to be having with you next is actually going to be a fairly interesting one. Because it also speaks to a lot of the issues that that local governments are facing in regards to dealing with on-the-ground policy action, and especially dealing with how do we affect change through the types of bylaws and policies that are necessary to incorporate protection for species at risk. I'm not sure how many people are aware, but there was definitely a bit of a change happening in BC with the rescinding of the Environmental Development Permit Areas bylaw in Saanich last week. It was a very emotive and contentious public issue, and Council in Saanich decided to rescind that bylaw that had been around for 5 years. There are a number of things at play with that, but you know, from my end, I found it very disappointing to see that happening. You know, certainly my sympathies go out to staff at the District of Saanich for having put so much time and effort and blood, sweat, and tears into that bylaw, and seeing those changes happening. So it was suggested that it may take a very long time before we see that sort of progressive bylaw happening again. In growing population areas like the Capital Regional District. But we still have similar types of progressive municipal policies and bylaws happening here on the South Coast, and that's one of the reasons why I asked Erica to actually be a presenter this morning.